Hello, everybody. Welcome to Flambeau Noir 2021. And today we have a guest, the presenter SMQ of the channel SMQ AI. Now, if you aren't familiar with who SMQ is, he got his big break on YouTube with a video that he put out describing a concept that he referred to as "We All Died in 2012." And that led into exploring further deeper into the Mandela effect. And it's a lot deeper than just a list of pop culture misrememberings. It goes much, much deeper than that. And SMQ explored that rabbit hole quite intensely. And in the past couple of years, you've also gotten really deep into these Freedom of Information Act government document dumps where they describe occult experiments that you might as well say that the government
hmm
was engaging in to try and do psychic spies, essentially. And
Correct.
they did remote viewing to try and gather intelligence, but what they ended up finding was they encountered entities on the other side.
hmm
And so that's something that you've been getting more into lately as well, right?
That's correct. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. And for uh, today's talk, you have it. It's titled "Celestial Political Theater."
Yes, correct.
Okay, so I might as well let you take the floor, and I will put you on full screen here, and then you can give your talk.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, here you go.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. So, I wanted to talk today about popular notions about hard material science versus what we would perceive as the occult, anything like psi, anything like that. I wanted to kind of bridge the gap there and go a little bit deeper in the popular notions and popular understandings of both subjects and see where they overlap a lot more once you get into some of those FOIA requests that we talked about and some of the literature that's out there than is that the population generally understands. So I'd first like to start out with the book from Donald Tyson called Sexual Alchemy. And this is a section called The Mechanism of Perception. And I think it would be a good place to start out with what he has to say. Under this, I want to highlight just one sentence that really kind of encapsulates an important piece of this whole puzzle, which says, the world is just as much a mental construction as the spirit and exists inside your mind. Now, that will be really important later. In the same place that the spirits exists. And then it goes on to explain in under a section called Spirits and Senses. What is true about your visual perception of spirits is equally true about all the other sensory impressions they cause to arise within your mind. Now, the concentration of this entire section that Donald Tyson talks about is perception and the mind itself. And I think a popular understanding about the mind is, maybe not perhaps with all folks, but the popular perception is the mind is contained within the skull, and everything that happens within the skull, all of those mechanisms that happen are within those kind of boundaries, those kind of physical boundaries. But when we get further into the less known literature that's actually out there, we start to understand broader schisms and you start to read now actually read some quotes from some interesting paperwork here about the lack of understanding that science has, the lack of understanding of exactly where the mind ends and observable reality begins. And intertwined with all of those kinds of things, you have this broken model of reality that science is starting to come face to face to. One of the articles that we have here, one of the FOIA documents we have, is from a scientist called Henry Pierce Stop, and it talks about quantum physics. And the big schism right now in science with quantum physics and the regular sort of Newtonian physics that we all deal with at the subatomic level up versus the subatomic level down is sort of this inflection point between the two. When you go subatomic down, you have quantum. Subatomic up, you sort of have this kind of reality that we all see around us. And the big schism is that we all know the laws of reality around us, and it's well documented. We understand, or at least science, purports to understand exactly how everything works. You can't walk through walls. If a tank is coming after you, you're in deep trouble. We all understand those kinds of things. Um, However, once science starts getting to the subatomic level into the quantum level, then things change drastically. So, one of the broader examples that's out there right now is in our world, the way we look at things, we assume that when we stop looking at something, for example, let's say a room, that room will be there whether or not it's being observed or not. And and in most cases, that is the case. However, in the subatomic level and the quantum level, whenever you look at these subatomic particles, they've observed that they behave differently whether or not they're being observed or not. Now, when they figured that out, called the double slit experiment, it was to say it was an earthquake in the scientific world is a great understatement because as you go to the atomic and then the subatomic level, to have the rules change so dramatically, it sort of opens up this kind of gap between the world that we perceive and what's actually going on. In subatomic, it's inside of you, it's all around you, it's inside all of us. And I just wanted to quote from Henry Pierce Stopp about this. And this is from, the CIA dump that they did back, I believe it was in 2003. It was 1.8 million documents. And inside it says here, quantum theory is a theory of observations. The realities it deals with are certain observations of scientists who use the theory. These observations are only a small part of reality. Consequently, quantum theory, considered as a theory of reality, is incomplete. Prevailing opinions, in fact, that no complete theory of reality can adequately describe the quantum phenomena. So, right there, um, Dr. Dr. Stapp, by all reports, a leading scientist, goes into the fact that they can't adequately explain quantum theory. Now, nowadays, you can hear about D-Wave and the buzz around, quantum computations and how it reaches into other realities to do computations that all the computation power in this reality right now would take thousands of years to do, and they do it in a minute or so. Um, and all of that is really attractive, and it's very exciting to hear about and everything. But these are things that have happened just in the last 5 years or so, and have really surfaced in the public consciousness in the last 2 or 3 years. Um, so if we go deeper, though, scientists have always known that there's an issue with our perceptions of reality, our perceptions and our understanding of reality. And I want to quote here from another document, another CIA document from Dr. Inomata Suji. Um, he says here in his paper, The 21st Century, the Era of New Science and New Technology, Beyond Modern Physics, the Emergence of Psychotronics. In the beginning, Western European philosophy, which formed the foundation of modern physics, was a reductionist two-dimensional theory of mind and matter, which said it was possible to explain all the world's phenomena in physical and chemical terms. The main reason why modern science has now reached an impasse, now this is from 1977, I believe, is that it has neglected the category of consciousness, something non-existent that has to do with matter or energy. However, in recent years, Eastern philosophies have been looked at again as part of a reformulation of Western philosophy, so that, for example, they can appear in a seminar entitled Science and Consciousness. And this was held in Cordoba, Spain in 1979, which is apparently a seminal moment in science and consciousness. Here, the concept of space in which existence and non existence are interrelated was through and expressed, in other words, nothing other than the existence and functioning of matterless ether. It has not been possible to explain virtual energy, energy of paranormal phenomena, by the relationship between matter and energy in conventional physics. So, right there, you start to highlight and you start to understand the schism that's happening in science between understanding what consciousness is, understanding what matter and the physical world that we experience, and how it relates to the quantum world itself. And that quantum world almost seems like there's a gap there. It almost seems like a blind spot in science. And I think a lot of that is where you start to understand this ubiquitous ether that everyone talks about. It's this thing that we sort of abandoned around the late 19th century in science, probably even earlier than that, if you probably have most scientific historians. So, what is this all leading to? What does this schism have to do with the occult? What does all of this have to do with Donald Tyson? Well, I think what nicely pulls all of these kinds of things together is what I would consider one of the most important and seminal FOIA documents ever released, and it's called Analysis and Assessment of the Gateway Process. Now, in this document that is dated June 9th, 1983, there was a particular a soldier that was tasked with going to the Monroe Institute. And with the Monroe Institute, they were trying to understand the psychic world, whether or not it was bunk, what they could do with it, what the Monroe Institute was doing with it, how it was handling these kinds of things like remote viewing, astral projection, and all of the other things that most popular scientists in the public eye would consider completely bunk. And what came back um, to the commanding officer of this particular soldier was that indeed it was worthwhile. It was a worthwhile study. It was a worthwhile pursuit, and not only that, um, they started to lay out a document here of how to pursue such things, and it's really shocking. And before I get into some of the techniques that they pursued, I wanted to set up some of the highlights that Wayne M. McDonnell, he was a lieutenant commander with the Army, what he notes inside of this document. It's really important stuff. He talks here about holograms, and this section is very interesting. Energy creates, stores, and retrieves meaning in the universe by projection of expanding at certain frequencies in three-dimensional mode. That creates a living pattern called a hologram. And then from the hologram, we get into the consciousness matrix. The consciousness matrix. The universe is composed of interacting energy fields, some at rest and some in motion. It is in and of itself one gigantic hologram of unbelievable complexity. According to the theories of Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist at Stanford University, and David Bohm, a physicist at the University of London, the human mind is also a hologram, which attunes itself to the universal hologram by medium of energy exchange, thereby deducing meaning and achieving the state which we call consciousness. So already, hopefully, you're seeing the bridge there, where scientists at one end were saying there's this gap between the material world that we see, the quantum world that we cannot see, and this ether of consciousness that is out there and is still not quantifiable. And this document begins to explain how to quantify this. I was assuming, since it was having to be requested in a FOIA request, this was probably a top secret document at some point. This goes on to explain at least how the US government, and particularly the Department of Defense, views reality itself. We're sort of looking behind the curtains of the intelligence apparatus of the United States. Now, granted, this is 40 years behind what they're probably doing right now. So I would imagine that, this isn't exactly the most dangerous information to get out. But what we're starting to do is we're starting to understand the nature of consciousness, what its role is in the reality all around us and exactly what the mind is and what the mind does. And why this is important to set all this up, because the technique that they actually used at the time at the Monroe Institute was this hemisync process where they would take the right side of the brain, the left side of the brain, and they would use this process of vibrational frequency and sound, and they would get both sides of the brain to attune themselves to one another. And by doing that, what they were able to do is get the mind, get the brain to do this process called clicking out. Now, clicking out is whenever the the mind of the soldier was able to leave space time, this existence that we call reality. And once the soldier was able to do that, using this process, this almost cymatic process of vibrational frequency, they were able to interact with, they call it non-corporeal intelligent entities that were outside of this space-time. But I'll get into that later. The technique, the technique itself actually is, it emphasizes right here, specifically, it does by comparing the images received with that part of its own hologram, which constitutes memory. By registering differences in geometric forms and in energy frequency, the consciousness perceives, quote, contrary to what everyone knows is so, it may not be that the brain produces consciousness, but rather consciousness that creates the appearance of the brain. So what they would do is they would, once outside of time space, they would take these geometric patterns and frequencies and they would sort of latch onto that and use that as a vehicle to go farther out into existence. And they would also attune these patterns into this process called patterning. So once they got out of there, there's a section here called Special Status of the Outer Body Experience. Although human consciousness can, with enough practice, move beyond the dimension of time, space, and interface with other energy systems in other dimensions, the entire process is appreciably enhanced if that consciousness can be detached in large measure from the physical body before such an interface is attempted. Once an individual becomes proficient in techniques of outer body movement and reaches the point where he is able to break out of time space while out of his body, he gains the advantage of, quote, clicking out, which I spoke about, part of his enhanced consciousness, while starting from a base location much closer to the dimension with which he wishes to communicate. So that was that process they're talking about of clicking out, and how clicking out is attuned, or how clicking out is achieved is by attuning the brain to the vibrational frequency of the dimension that is sort of the next door dimension. And once that's obtained, according to this documentation, it's much easier to reach further and further out into these other dimensions. It says here, as a result, a self-reinforcing process should ensue whereby the farther consciousness can go in an out-of-body state, it can be projected beyond the time-space dimension, the more its level of energy output would be enhanced, thus promoting the potential for still further travel. The tentative conclusion to be drawn is that the out-of-body state may be regarded as an extremely effective way accelerating the process of enhancing consciousness and interfacing with dimensions beyond time-space. So you have a set of these officers, these soldiers, attuning their left and right brain together, and by doing so, they're able to reach beyond this space-time. And when you start to think about this and you read the other, even popular science that's out there, you start thinking about this vibrational thing, the cymatics. And cymatics is the study of vibration and frequency. What is it all about? Um, and what pulls all this stuff together is that it's all about vibration and frequency. Everything around us has a vibrational signature. Um, And we all know that one of the most important points of this kind of hologram that they're talking about is that in order to attune into the signature of another dimension would be to actually vibrate at its same frequency, and then you can click out of that dimension. And that's exactly what is purported that these soldiers did before this document was written. Um, and now we're starting to see that things like photosynthesis with a leaf, something as mundane as photosynthesis, they're starting to study that in the quantum world, because what happens is um, light will touch on a leaf, and simultaneously that light will be able to be registered and will be able to be distributed all at one time. It's not as if the light enters one membrane and then you can watch it being distributed even at a fast rate. That's not how it happens. Light is immediately distributed inside of a leaf, inside of all of the substructures of a leaf. And the reason why it can do that is the idea is just like with clicking out, you're able to go outside of this space time, which indicates that outside of the space time you have an acausal or retrocausal nature to all of this reality. So this reality, you can kind of look at it as a kind of a we're on a Ferris wheel, and we're going and we're going and we're going and everything's whirling about us. But outside of the Ferris wheel would be like clicking out and getting off the Ferris wheel. And that's where these soldiers, that's where all of the energy that we're pulling from in terms of D wave and other, quantum computations, that's where um, everything in terms of the power that we're seeking, that this version, this dimension, this vibrational frequency, this signature that we're all experiencing together simply can't pull from because there are so many limitations to it. So anyway, once the soldiers got beyond this time space, they had to do this process to protect themselves because they were in a foreign dimension, a foreign version of reality that they weren't used to. So they created this technique called patterning. And I'll go ahead and quote again from this. In other words, the techniques of patterning recognizes the fact that since consciousness is the source of all reality, our thoughts have the power to influence the development of reality in space-time as it applies to us if those thoughts can be projected with adequate intensity. However, the more complicated the objective thought sought, the more radically it departs from our current reality. The more time the universal hologram will need to reorient our reality sphere to accommodate our desires. Monroe trainers caution against attempting to force the pace of this process because the individual could succeed in dislocating his existing reality with drastic consequences. This kind of plays into what Jeremy and I were talking about the other day. There's a big difference with trying to change this reality with techniques of the occult, trying to change this reality with the techniques of will, having reality bend to your will. There's a big difference with having a check delivered to you for $500 so you can pay a bill or make rent versus changing the fundamental properties of gravity, let's say. There's a very big difference between the two. And that's more or less what patterning is addressing. Patterning, what these soldiers were doing in these other versions or other dimensions, were not only using it to protect themselves, they were using it as a vehicle to sort of reorient themselves with this version of reality, as well as reorient themselves with the next version of reality. Sort of pull off a kind of practical magic so you can kind of, for lack of a better term, not literally teleport yourself, but kind of teleport yourself to another version of reality. Now, the thing that kind of ties this all together, besides what I've just said, is one of the more interesting things, and it kind of brings about one of the topics that I'm very interested in is the spiritual realm, the nature of the spiritual realm, the nature of the occult, and how there can be an interface with modern technology with all of these things, because I often think about, the nature of ideas and very naturally talented, to certain ideas that come to you. So it kind of lends itself to it. Are there exterior intelligences guiding us? Students of the occult naturally would say yes. And given this document, perhaps, and given the schism that science is running into right now between the quantum world and that gap between the sort of Newtonian physics that we all deal with right now on Earth, perhaps that gives us that room, that ether, for that spiritual component to be really considered in the future with science. So it talks about the out of body experience whenever you click out and what you can be expected to see once you click out and you're using the patterning process to protect you. And they would do it with a soldiers in a three soldier formation for patterning. And it says here towards the end of the document, it's just sort of a passing thing they say. It's kind of funny. I guess they didn't want to get too into it. Be intellectually prepared to react to possible encounters with intelligent non-corporeal energy forms when time-space boundaries are exceeded. Arrange to have groups of people in focused 12 state unite their altered consciousness to build holographic patterns around sensitive areas to repulse possible unwanted out of body presences. So, and it says here encourage more advanced gateway practitioners to build holographic patterns of successful attainment and rapid progress for advanced colleagues to assist them in processing through the gateway system. So, I think there's a lot to think about. There's a lot to chew on. There's a lot of documentation um, that kind of gives us that at least that pathway that like Inomata Suji spoke about, as well as what Henry Pierce Stapp talked about. That schism in science, I think, is something to do with that gap, that ether, that spiritual component that needs to be reconsidered in a way that isn't considered right now in the more popular perceptions of science. Now, that's not to say they're not doing that in the universities, in some of the R&D corporations out there, in some of the defense corporations that are out there. Certainly that is absolutely most likely going on. But I think that ways to free up um, larger bits of funding, ways that people can be more open about the ways in which they could funnel this kind of research would be to be more open and talk about these kinds of things that scientists have been talking about probably for the last 40 years. And before I go, I want to talk about one of the more interesting documents that I came across, that my team and I came across, was this thing called the Round Robin Papers. And in the Round Robin Papers, and this is as early as 1944 or 45, I believe, and in it, it was talking about dealing with UFOs, dealing with aliens, and it was saying that the craft itself is not a nuts and bolts craft made of steel and a combustion engine like maybe someone from the 1940s would think about, but more or less the craft itself was something like holographic or something that would be akin to like a moving picture. And in the round robin papers and all of this documentation you can find on my YouTube channel if you want to just browse through the documents, particularly the entry video. You can get the whole library of this documentation. But they were talking about these craft would lock into the vibrational frequency of this reality and then sort of vibrate into this reality, and then they would just sort of pop in. And, oftentimes you think UFOs, little green men, and then they cue the X-File music but all of this stuff is kind of related. And I think if we talk about it more and we take it more seriously, or the broader public takes it more seriously, start to remove some of the fear about these kinds of subjects, I think funding could go to all of those different institutions that I talked about. And I think that a lot of the sciences could get out of its sort of juvenile infancy when this juvenile thinking when it comes to these kinds of topics, because these things are real. And whenever you say, "Oh, well, it's just in your mind," your mind is massive. You just don't know how massive it is. It's everything. So I think that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
It was fascinating. Um, and I see that a lot of people here were really intrigued by in the chat. We're talking about how intrigued they were by these topics, and so one question I had here, somebody was asking if we could get links to those documents.
Yeah, yeah. The bulk of those documents are an SMQ AI YouTube channel.
Okay,
Um, the vast, and in fact, it includes popular science articles like the Leaf article I was talking about, as well as plenty of other links. But Jeremy, if you like, what I could do later on is give you a consolidated list yourself of the links. Most of this is in the FBI and CIA FOIA vault that they released to the public back in 2003. And but a lot of it too that I quote here is with popular articles that just sort of go by the wayside. So sure.
cool. Yeah, that would be great. And what I can do
Hmm.
is I can put those links in a comment and pin it to this video. So
Sure.
when people come back later, then they can find those links.
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, some people are excited about that. So somebody here, okay, Stephanie says lucid dreaming techniques don't work in this scenario. Now, I'm not sure exactly what scenario they were referring to, but um, I guess they're trying to figure out if you could use lucid dreaming techniques to click out.
Well, I know with the hemisync process because I did Gateway for about a year. And I didn't go there are steps that you've got to go through the Gateway process. And I started to veer off into my own kind of practice from the Gateway process once I became comfortable with it. I didn't go as far as clicking out, but I would imagine if you were to go through the entire hemisync regiment and you were to finally click out, I would imagine that that would unlock. And this is speculation on my part because I haven't actually gone through the entire regiment and clicked out. I would imagine that you would gain some very helpful insight to lucid dreaming, astral projection, all of the things that that take place that you would imagine take place outside of your mind, but I think actually go on inside your mind. But I also think your mind is a collection of independent nodes or that we call consciousness that come together to aggregate this thing we call reality. Because ultimately what I think is going to happen, and this is just speculation on my part, is what we see in the quantum world where reality shifts to whether or not it's being observed. I think it's happening in the aggregate because there's so many of us viewing reality at one time. I think that reality is we're going to see that it does shift. And that also brings in our research with the Mandela effect, and that it goes so much deeper with history. And you get people like Anatoly Fomenko, who is a Russian mathematician, that the further he got into history, the more it dissolved right in front of him. And that's because, you've got in the aggregate of consciousness that's actually paying attention to reality. It's not paying attention to that. And that lends itself to morphing. It lends itself to changing. It lends itself to all of those things. So that sort of ties all of this back up together into sort of one stream here. So I got off on a tangent. Sorry.
Oh no, that's fine. It's interesting stuff. So I have another question here. Where is it here? What are the dangers of remaining in the parallel universe permanently?
Well, we can infer from the document that just trying to make changes that are too drastic, even within an acceptable time frame, has devastating consequences for the individual. Because it sounds to me like that if you try to make changes that are too dramatic, there's no way back. Like the gateway closes. So I would imagine it's something. like duration, though we wouldn't see duration like I'm sure duration is experienced in a different way than we experience it here. I would imagine that it would be just as destructive in terms of if you want to come back. None of those things were actually addressed in the document, which I found interesting. They left a lot out of that document with questions that you naturally, I'm sure, were answered either in subsequent documents or they were answered in that document and were left out. So I would imagine that it's the same thing as trying to change that reality using your will or using the techniques they talked about, such as patterning with a three-person formation.
So another question I have here is so somebody lateral says I've never had any lasting damage from using the gateway process or astral projection, etc. Worse is being shaken up, and that's kind of my experience as well. I have had a few experiences that left me kind of shaken,
Mhm.
um, and sometimes even physically, almost like I'd been, I don't know what you'd call it, zapped,
Mhm.
for lack of a better term, but nothing that seemed too serious. Um,
I know me, my experiences with Gateway, I mean, I had time slippages. I I thought I would have these strange moments where I would have conversations with someone or something, and then I would come back and not remember it, almost like you would in a dream. But I didn't go all the way down to the path of clicking out. And there is a set of processes that you can do to go all the way out. And I got far enough to where I started to veer off into my own kind of practice. So that got me started though, in realizing how deep this went. So I started to go off. And because I knew and I had heard enough about Gateway from different folks that it can be something that you would probably want a trainer with once you finally started to get so far out. And
hmm,
just the shock that I would feel being at the lower levels, I could see why you would want to go to the Monroe Institute and have a guide with you to take you through all the way through the gateway.
okay, yeah, I remember you mentioning that to me when we
Mm-hmm.
had some conversations, like private conversations,
Mm-hmm.
a while back. Is that what you're talking about when you say go all the way to the end of the process? Is that what Focus 21 is? Because you had mentioned Focus 21 in your
Mm-hmm.
talk a couple
Yeah.
times in the that was referenced in the material.
So yeah, it goes. I don't know. I haven't gone far enough, you know, but I know people who tell me that they've gone all the way, and it's what's been said to me about it is what the document says, that you do encounter these things. You are an alternate, reality. But see, this isn't that far removed from traditional magic, ceremonial magic, occult, tantra, those kinds of practices that would get you in that kind of state. I think the only difference here is is that it seems to me, and I don't know if it's designed that way. It seems to me that it seems a bit. I wouldn't say as far as dangerous. I don't have another word for it, but I would want to be more cautious in terms of going alone. From everything that I've heard, sort of some of the just side bars that I've heard before about it and how powerful it can be. So I really don't know. I can only talk about the only thing concrete I can talk about is my own experience with it, and what I've read about it and what the literature from the Monroe Institute themselves talk about. Now, I don't think I got the military grade version. So the what I have, the hemiseek process I have,
Hmm.
can take you all the way. And what you can get outside of the Monroe Institute that the general public has is probably I would imagine a watered down version because they don't want you obviously to get in trouble using this. So perhaps you would have to go to the Monroe Institute itself in order to go all the way out and have these kinds of incredible experiences.
So, Seamus had a follow up question. Have you ever encountered anything terrifying?
I think the closest thing that I came to something terrifying would be during lucid dreaming. Um, and and that was outside of Gateway, so I don't want to say anything bad about the Monroe Institute or the Gateway process or anything like that. Now, yes, but that was my own practice and me doing my own thing on my own. But yes, I've encountered things that have startled me, things that have pulled me out of the state. So yes.
Okay, A2 Melku has a question here, which is interesting. It says, what is SMQ's thoughts on a greater slash higher self that is external to our physical being, and which makes itself known through our physical self, thus being our true consciousness and true self?
Yeah, yeah, the higher self and yeah, I think that's something I can't disagree with. I think that's something that is important. I believe in a team, a guardian team. Now, whether that's we perceive that as separate entities, and it is just one entity that we just can't perceive. I've I perceive a benevolence that is a guide there. Now, whether that's me guiding myself, I haven't gone that far yet. And understand, I've only been doing this I did Gateway for a year before I started to do my own practice for a year. So, and I've only been doing this kind of stuff and this research for about 4 years. And these documents, this dump was from when we started to do the hard research from my team, Buster and Chick. Once we started to do the hard research, Buster brought these documents to me and we started to, pour through them and started to pick out what was really cool about them. And that's when we started to, and that's when I was able to get a hold of some of the hemisync material, and that's whenever I started to experiment with it on myself. And that's where I started to have, I guess you would consider them supernatural experiences, but I consider the supernatural, I consider that term just something that science has. There's too much fear there to understand the depths of our consciousness, to understand the depths of what we are, where our ideas come from, what is consciousness? Do we contain a traditional thing like a soul, or is it more or less like some kind of blend of consciousness or something else? I certainly know the reductive materialist point of view that is popularly perceived as not really the case, that there is much, much, much more out there. So that's how I would put it. Um, I wouldn't put a label like a holy guardian angel, but perhaps it is. It's still what I perceive as a benevolent force that can guide you.
Yeah, and I think expectation plays a big role in how
Yes.
it manifests to you or appears to you in
Hmm.
some way, or in a vision, or however it appears to you. I think expectation has a big role in that.
And piggybacking off what you said right there, and we spoke about this a little bit, the expectation is so important because you have to get your mind in the set that you're going to experience something pleasant, something that is profound or pleasant, or at least something benign at a minimum. Because if you go into this with fear, if you go into anything like this, and you're terrified, you're not ready. You're not ready to do it. And you've got to break through that barrier, particularly anybody who is in the modern world where this is supposed to be something that is terrifying. In movies and popular culture, we're trained, to think that this is something bad or terrifying or something that is, and it's none of those things if you actually start doing it.
So we have one more question here, and it's what is gateway?
I mean, from the documentation I see I mean, I would think that it seems, I I think that it's probably some kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, some kind of portal, perhaps, that either our mind creates or it's some kind of way for our mind to tap into something that is already existing. But either way, it has to be. a mind that's ready, a mind that is attuned to a particular vibrational signature, and a mind that is, you know, that is brave. So I would say it's a portal. And I don't want to sound hyperbolic to say it's a portal to another dimension, but that's what it says. And I also think it's almost a bit self-defeative that we have, this big Hollywood machine that uses all these phrases, and then we're trained to think, oh, that's so ridiculous. And it's really a shame because, if we weren't trained that way, we would be more open to this kind of material and experimenting with it.
Absolutely, it's fascinating the depths of the human mind
Yeah.
and where it can take you, and the idea that it could be a antenna and that we're
Mhm.
exploring um, and that we're exploring from uh, all kinds of things. Essentially the brain is almost like a radio, you could say, where it's
Yeah.
receiving a signal and then generating an experience based off of that signal, right?
Absolutely. It's an antenna, and we could be remotely logging in, so to speak, to this body. And this body itself is just a vibrational image in a holographic world. I mean, it's endless what you could think about it. Absolutely.
So let me see here if there's any more questions. um, okay. Latrell referred to Gateway as it's a series of guided meditations which uses binaural beats and was developed
Hmm.
at the Monroe Institute.
Hmm. Yes, absolutely. Yep.
So yeah, depending on how you took that question, you answered one version of the question, and that's the other answer, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, what is the gateway itself is what you answered, right?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, exactly. It's right. That's the way the actual process itself. Yeah, but yes, it is. It's a series of guided meditations, and you use these binaural beats to attune the left and right side of your brain, and then you can, as they say, click out and have these experiences.
So essentially, it is like a radio in a sense, because if you tune a radio to a certain frequency, you get it resonating at a certain frequency, then it will take that bandwidth, that it'll listen to that specific bandwidth of signal. And it's kind of like the same thing you're doing here. You're getting both hemispheres of the brain to sync up on a specific frequency, and that frequency is going to resonate with signals, perhaps, that you're going to receive from a specific bandwidth. And then the circuitry of the brain takes that signal and generates an experience from it, which is that what we refer to sometimes as an out of body experience, or what they would have referred to as clicking out.
Hmm.
Is that right?
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it too. And staying out too long, or doing trying to change something may change just slightly the vibrational signature of what is you. And perhaps that makes you not be able to tune back into that antenna here that's you in the brain. And perhaps that distortion is why the consequences they warn are so dramatic, is because you're not able to come back. So that's probably why I hear so many anecdotal stories about habit trainer when you get really far into this thing.
So where do you think this is my question?
Hmm.
We'll finish off on this one, I guess. So
Okay.
um, you said earlier that the material that we're working with by exploring, that you've explored during your talk and that we've talked about before, and that you've gone in very detailed examination on your channel,
Hmm.
um, that it's 40-year-old material.
Yes.
So where do you think, in your speculation, like your educated guess on where they're at now, what is the U.S. government exploring now, and what capabilities do you think they have?
I'll just preface this with saying that it's pure speculation, but just the fact that we have I mean, the Mandela effect. You have changes in, World War II. Now we have the Axis forces bombing California. We have the Axis forces bombing the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Just the fact that these subtle changes are starting to we have a terrorist attack on the Statue of Liberty by German forces during World War One. Those things tell me that, you know, the Lindbergh baby. There's three different versions of what happened to the Lindbergh. Those those seminal moments in history that seemingly, when you look deeper into them, you find out all these strange facts that the people were there on the ground when it was happening, saying no, it didn't happen. That Australia was no longer part of D-Day, and that it was fighting on the ground in Australia in World War II. Those kinds of questions in recent history, those kinds of questions lend itself to, it's 40 years on and they're able to change what is going on with other versions of reality. Could it be possible that they've been able to change this reality in some meaningful way and they continue to tinker with it and experiment with it? I think, obviously, again, I got to say it's speculation, but I think that that's, if you were to go, in this line of thinking from the documents that are out there, I think it's reasonable, at least something that you can put on the table, that it's completely possible 40 years on, that they're changing elements of history, they're changing elements of reality. I think that's completely possible. If this documentation were to be taken literal and very seriously, and I take it seriously, so I think, who knows?
So essentially, active, effective time travel is your speculation. You boil it down
It,
to, you could say.
You could put it that way, sure. I mean, it's not time travel like Back to the Future where you're jumping in something and you're doing. It's more or less like stepping out of this, stepping off the Ferris wheel and being able to see it for what it is, and then jumping on at a different time, so to speak. Maybe. Again, I'm really speculating, but yeah, I mean, you know, I,
Or
I mean,
method of time in some way.
they're talking about dealing with entities in other dimensions in a DoD Army document. So, I mean, really, almost anything's on the table at this point. I mean,
So I did say that was going to be the last question, but this one, Paul Frederick, who you know,
mhm.
asked the question, and I wanted to just see what your answer was to this.
Okay.
So, is space fake?
Wow. I think as long as we observe and expect space to be what it is, I think it will continue to be what it is with the mass of the population. That's what I think. I think space is real, as long as people experience in a way that's real and meaningful to them. Yes.
Great. Well, I guess we can close off on that one. And I really appreciate you participating in this project, this conference, and contributing your time and energy to the community for free to give people this content. And I really appreciate that you're doing this and giving away such fascinating information and stuff to chew on. You know, good juicy bits of information to chew on.
No, and I appreciate you inviting me, and I really appreciate that.
We have a comment here. The concept kind of pulls out the rug from everything you thought you knew to be true or real. It's a real paradigm changer. Absolutely, Brugia.
Yeah, when we started getting into this material, the more you read about it, the you end up with a headache because you're just trying to contemplate it all, and it's a lot to take in.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well, thanks again, and we'll be talking again soon, I'm sure.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Have a good one. Thank you.
You too. Thank you, Jeremy. Bye.